theyeshiva.net.
The fourth and last perek of Hilchos Krishma deals with people, individuals who are exempt of the mitzvah of Krishma. It also deals with circumstances that if you are in those circumstances, you are exempted from the biblical mitzvah of reading Shema twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. Says the Rambam, Halacha Aleph, Noshim v'avadim uktanim pturim mikriya Shema. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the mitzvah of Krias Shema. However, we teach the children to read Krishma in the appropriate time and to make a blessing before and after, as the Rambam explained in Perek Aleph, in order to educate them in the performance of mitzvahs. Children are exempt from the mitzvahs, but nonetheless, the rabbis gave an obligation on the father to be mechanech, to educate a child age appropriate in the mitzvah, so that when he becomes bar mitzvah and is obligated in the mitzvahs, he will already have the full know-how of how to perform all the mitzvahs. So Krias Shema is not an exception. So age appropriate, you have to educate your child to say Krias Shema in the right time and make the blessings before and after, so that he will be educated in the performance of mitzvahs. However, women and slaves are exempt from Krias Shema, but we have a principle in halacha that mitzvahs esei shazman grama, all positive commandments that are time-bound. For example, the mitzvah of shofar applies only to the day of Rosh Hashanah, or the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah or shaking a lulav applies only to the 7 days of Sukkot. So these are mitzvahs that have a fixed time, excluding other times. The same is true with Krias Shema. Krias Shema has a fixed time, the time in the morning and the time in the evening when we're obligated to say the Shema, and therefore women are exempt from this mitzvah. Also avodim, non-Jewish slaves that were purchased by Jews, and they assume a semi-Jewish status and are obligated only in the mitzvahs that women are obligated in, they too would be exempt from Krishma. It's interesting, the Yerushalmi's Masechta Brachas Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel brings another source and explanation why avodim are patur from Krishma. He says because it says Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. In order to authentically be able to say Shema, you cannot have any other boss and master in your life. He says a slave has another adon, he has another master in his life, and therefore he's simply not capable of authentically declaring Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Continues the Rambam. Misha haya liboy taruz v'nechbaz ledvar mitzvah. Pater mikol ha-mitzvahs u'mikriyas Shema. Somebody whose heart is overwhelmed, involved and engaged in doing a mitzvah, so he is exempt from all the mitzvahs, including from Krias Shema. We have a principle in halacha, the Gemara explains it in Sukkah Daf Chafei and brings the sources. Ha'oisek b'mitzvah pater min ha-mitzvah. When somebody is involved in one mitzvah, generally they're exempt from doing any other mitzvah that comes up during that time. Here the chiddush is that even though the person is not actively doing a mitzvah every moment that they're obligated to do Shema, but because this is a type of mitzvah that occupies your entire mental space, so as long as you're overwhelmed and involved in trying to fulfill this mitzvah, during that time you're exempt from all the mitzvahs, including Krias Shema. What would be a practical application of this? Lefichach, therefore, chasen shenasa psula. A chasen, a groom, who marries a Median, pater mikriya Shema sheyavi alah. He's exempt from the mitzvah of Krishma until he actually has physical intimacy with her. Why? Because marriage, getting married and building a Jewish family, pru'urvu, is a mitzvah. So he is now occupied until he's actually physically together with her. He is stressed out. His mind, his heart is overwhelmed. There is tension, there is fear, there is concern, there is anxiety, there's anticipation, there's joy, there's expectation. But he's completely overwhelmed. His mind is not. His mental space is occupied by something that's a mitzvah, which is the relationship with his new wife. The Rambam said, "Lefisha ein daite pnuya." His das, his mind is just not open. His mental space is being occupied by the mitzvah. Shemalayim tzala psulim. He's very nervous. Perhaps he won't find the psulim in her. He won't find her to be a virgin. V'im sha'ad mitzvah Shabbos v'loy baal. However, if he waited till Mitzvah Shabbos and he didn't have relations, then Chayiv Likus from Mitzvah Shabbos Veilach. Then he's obligated to read Krishma from Mitzvah Shabbos and on, even though they were not physically together yet, because he calmed down already, V'libay Gaspa, and he's much more comfortable with her, Afal Pishalei Bal, even though they did not have physical intimacy. They used to get married, the Mishneh says in Ksuvas, Psula Nisas Liyam Harivi. They used to get married either Tuesday night or during the day of Wednesday. So that's what the Rambam says. If he was together with her physically in the same home, they were a married couple on Wednesday, So it's Wednesday night for Tuesday night. They got married Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. So now he says by the time Mitzvah Shabbos comes, even though there was no physical intimacy, but he's already calmer, they're more comfortable with each other, they're not so shy, and therefore at this point he's already obligated in Krias Shema. But if somebody marries a woman who was already previously married, even though there's no question he's involved in a mitzvah, but chayav likros, he's obligated to say Krias because he's not doing this mitzvah 24 hours a day. So it's a mitzvah, but there's time in the morning and in the evening to say Krishma, because there's nothing that's so overwhelming that's going to occupy his mental space. So he knows she was already a married woman, and therefore he doesn't have these types of concerns. And the same should be applied to any scenario that reflects these above cases. Gimel. If somebody, heaven forbid, loses an individual, that the Torah obligates him to mourn for this individual. There are basically 7 relatives where there is an obligation of Avelis. They are enumerated in Parshas Emer. If somebody loses Chalila, a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a son, and a daughter. And then there's also the 7th one, which is a spouse. So if any of these types of relatives pass away and the person is obligated to grieve for them, Pater Mikriya Shema Ad Sheyikberenu, he is exempt from the mitzvah of Krishma until he brings this person to burial, because he simply does not have the mental space to be able to focus on Krias Shema. And as we learned earlier, the Rambam told us in Perik Beis that Kavanas Halev, certainly in the first pasuk, is a prerequisite for Krias Shema. The person has to have the mental space to accept the sovereignty of the kingdom of heaven and to declare Hashem's oneness. But in this state, the depth of anxiety and loss and grief and confusion and shock, etc., deprives the person from the serenity and calmness to be able to do Krias Shema, and therefore the person is exempt from Krias Shema. Similarly, if somebody is guarding the corpse, even though it's not his corpse, meaning it's not his relative, he's not obligated to take care, to grieve for this mace or to bury, but he's pater from Krias Shema because this is a mitzvah. And a oisik b'mitzvah, pater min ha-mitzvah. And the shmiras ha-mace, respecting the corpse and guarding it, they used to guard the mace. One of the reasons is the body shouldn't be eaten by worms or by any other creatures that can try to approach a corpse. So this is a mitzvah. So even though the time of Krias Shema comes and it passes, let's say the person is guarding the mace from before sunrise all the way for the next 3 hours, he's potter from Krias Shema because he's involved in Shmiras HaMace. But if there are 2 guards, then one of them continues watching the mace and the other one moves away to another place. And the Rambam says he has to move away to another place. You remember why? Because in Perek Gimel he said that you're not allowed to read Krias Shema near a corpse unless you move away Daled Amos. So he goes away and he reads, and then he comes back and he protects the mace. And the second one will go away and read Krias Shema and come back. Why? Because you don't need 2 shomrim. So one of them is doing the mitzvah, and the other one could go away because the mitzvah is being done by somebody else, and he could read the Shema, and then they can exchange places, and that way everybody reads Shema. Continues the Rambam, v'chein ha'chofer kever l'meis. If somebody is busy digging a grave for a mace, again, he's doing a mitzvah. Potter mikriya Shema, he is exempt from Krias Shema. And as the poskim explain, even when he takes a break, you could say, oh, he's not doing a mitzvah now, he's taking a break. He's digging and digging and digging and digging, and then he takes a 10-minute break. Say, oh, now it's time of Krias Shema. It's 7 a.m, you got to reach Shema. He's not mechuyev in Krias Shema because taking a break is part of the mitzvah, because if he doesn't take a break, he can't continue digging, which is a fascinating idea. In other words, the pause between the digging, that's part of the mitzvah because it's the energy that you need in order to continue digging. Dalet. Generally, we do not take out a mace in order to begin the funeral procession and the burial close to the time of Krias Shema, unless he was truly an extraordinary, great human being. We do not want that Jews should not read Krias Shema in the right time. And as we're going to see, once the funeral is happening, everything changes. So therefore, let the time of Krias Shema come, let them read Krias Shema, and then we'll begin the funeral. We don't start the funeral close to the time of Krias Shema. If you know that the funeral could start before the time of Krias Shema and finish, then it's not a problem, gesund to hate. But if you're going to start if you're going to start later, after the time of Kriyas began, fine. So they read Shema and they come to the funeral. But if you're going to start it close to the time of Kriyas Shema, what are you going to cause? You're going to cause anyone involved in this levaya, as we'll soon see, that they won't do the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema. So l'chatchila, if he's an Adam Gadol, if he's an extraordinary person, if he's a person of unique, magnificent spiritual stature, then the Rambam says it's fine. But if not, we will try to avoid this, of course, if we can. But if they did begin the funeral procession close to the time of Kriyas Shema, they took out the coffin, and the time of Kriyas Shema began, say sunrise is 6 o'clock, just for argument's sake, and they started this levaya at, let's say, 5 o'clock or 5:30 a.m., the time of Kriyas Shema comes, and now they're in middle of a funeral procession. Says the Rambam, Kol sheyesh limited tzarich behem, those who are needed to carry the bed of the mace, kigoin, noisei hamita, those who are carrying the coffin, the pallbearers, those who are carrying the bed, v'chilufeim, and their replacements, v'chilufei chilufeim, and the replacements for their replacements, because they usually had people who would carry the coffin, and then they would give it to another group of people, and they would often give it to a third group of people. So the Rambam says, all these people, those who are carrying it, those who are their replacements, those who are the replacements for their replacements, bein shayu lifnei hamita, bein shayu lacher hamita, whether they're ahead of the mitzvah, whether they're behind Pturin, they're all exempt from Kriyas Shema, even though the mitzvah has arrived. We know why. Ha'isik b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah. Just like the person who guards the maze, just like the person who digs the cave for the maze, the person who's carrying the mitzvah of the maze, this is a mitzvah. You're pater from the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema. Ushar ha'malavin shein lamitzvah tzarich behem. But all the other people who are joined the levaya and the coffin does not need them. In other words, they come out to the funeral out of respect for the person who passed away, but the mitzvah does not need them. So then chayavin, they are obligated in the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema. And the reason for this is, even though it's a mitzvah to go to the levaya and they're performing a mitzvah, but what does Krias Shema take? Krias Shema takes that they should stop for a moment and say the first pasuk. That's it. So they stop for a moment and say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and then they could continue walking on the levaya and saying Shema. So that means the mitzvah of Shema in no way will compromise or minimize even an iota of the kavod hames. Those who are carrying the mitzvah, they completely are focused on the mitzvah. They have to have their mental and physical strength to be focused on the mitzvah. We will not have them stop even for a moment and say Shema Yisrael and say Shema. They're completely exempt. Hey, hayu oiskim behesped v'giyas man krishma. Let's say the community is involved in a eulogy. They used to come together when somebody passed away, as is often still done, and somebody or many people would give hespedim, and people are listening. And now the time of Kriyas Shema arrives. It's 6 o'clock a.m. It's time for Kriyas Shema. Bisman sham meis munach lifneihem. If the mace is there by the eulogies, then nishmatim echad v'koirin, then each one slips out one by one, not everybody together, that would be disrespectful. But one by one you slip out and you read Shema. Again, they can't read Shema over there because that would be disrespectful to the mace, as we learned before. But they can go out and read Shema. And after you read, you come back to the eulogy. If the mace is not there, for example, the mace is in another room, then so then everybody could read Kriyas Shema. They don't have to leave. They could take a break in the hesped. Everybody reads Shema, and then they resume the hesped. And the avel, the mourner, sits quietly. As we learned before, he's not obligated to read Shema until after the burial. This is before the burial, so he could just remain there silent, and it's not a problem. They're not mocking him by reading Shema. It's not like reading Shema in front of a mace because he's chayiv in mitzvahs. It's just right now he's not chayiv, but he's going to be chayiv tomorrow or tonight. However, they could read Shema at this moment by the hesped. Vav. After the burial, till now we spoke on the way to the burial, the funeral, the eulogy. What about after the burial? So the burial finishes, and the avelim, those who are in grief, those who are grieving, the mourners, return from the grave to start accepting condolences and words of comfort from the community, from their friends, etc. So basically, the ritual was and is that the people follow them from the gravesite to the place where the mourners are standing, and over there they will stand in a row. Often they make 2 rows, and the mourners walk through the rows, or sometimes they would make a circle and encircle them. So they would make rows of people, and they would walk through these rows, and they would receive words of comfort from those who have gathered at the burial. So the Rambam says as follows. And remember, the time of Kriyas Shema has arrived. If there's actually a distance from the gravesite until the place where they're going to gather together and the mourners are going to go through to receive words of comfort. So there's time to begin and to finish. Even if it's only one pasuk, even if it's only one pasuk of Krishma that they could begin before they will arrive at the Shura where they're going to express comfort. So the Rambam says they should begin, because at this time the burial is over. Now they have, let's say, a few minutes, and they're obligated to do Krishma because there's no mitzvah now. Comforting the mourners is a mitzvah, but now there's a little break. So the Rambam says, if getting from the gravesite to this place will take some time, and they have time even just to begin and finish one pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, before they will arrive to the Shura, they should do so. V'im lav, if not, lo yaschilu, let them not begin. Eli yenachemu v'savelim, let them express comfort to those who are mourning. V'achar sheyipatru mehem yaschilu likris, and after they leave the avelim and they finish the mitzvah, then they will begin reading Krias Shema. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is that when the levaya is over, when the burial is over, so now they're mechuyev in mitzvahs. So if they have time to do Krias Shema before the next mitzvah, so they should do it. Even one pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Even one pasuk. However, if there's no time for that, so now they have a mitzvah ahead of them, so let them go do that mitzvah, and then afterwards they'll do Krias Shema. Bnei Adam ha'imdim b'shura. The people who are standing in the row, encircling the Avelim, or on the two sides where the Avelim walk through. Hapnimim sheim royim pnei ha'avelim. Those who are on the inside and they see the face of the mourners, p'turim Krias Shema. V'achitzonim, those on the outside, hoil ve'enim royim es ha'avelim, they don't see the Avelim. Chayavim b'Krias Shema b'mekaymam. They are mechuyev to read Krias Shema in their space. Why? Because since they don't see the panim of the Avelim, so they're not expressing words of tanchumim because they're not in close proximity to each other. They're on the outer layers, so therefore at this moment they are mechuyev in Krias Shema, so they should do Krias Shema. When the people in the front rows will leave and it will be their turn, of course, then they are doing the mitzvah and they're potter from Krias Shema. Zayin. Kol mishu potter malikris Krias Shema, im ratzel ha'achmer alatzme likris, kaire. Anyone who we said is exempt from Krias Shema, if he wants to be stringent on himself, that's fine. But he has to make sure that he has the mental space for it. But if this person who's exempt from reading Shema is stressed and he's overwhelmed, then he's actually forbidden to read Krias Shema until he calms down. Krias Shema has to be done with serenity, with kavanas halev, with calmness. So if he couldn't do it, fine. The Mishneh tells us in Masechta Brachas, Perek Beis, about Rabbi Gamliel, that the night that he got married, he married a woman, and that night he read Krias Shema. And the Talmidim said, you told us that a chassan is potter from Krias Shema, like we learned before in Halach Aleph. So he said, I'm not going to listen to you, levatel malchus shamayim, levatel emene malchus shamayim afilu shah achas. I cannot tolerate not living under the sovereignty of the oneness of Hashem even for 1 hour, and therefore I have to read Krias Shema. So Rabbi Gamliel was in a unique state. So a person just has to know, the Rambam says, if he has the serenity. The Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Krias Shema renders a verdict, it's quoting Tosfos in Brachas Daf Yud Zayin, that these days, chasanim, when they get married, they are mechuyev in Krias Shema. And he says the reason is, very interesting reason, the reason is because Tosfos says that in the olden days, the kavanah of Krias Shema was so intense, it was so real, it was so powerful, that indeed the stress of a chassid who married a young woman deprived him from the ability to do a genuine Krias Shema. But he says today, let's face it, even in a good day, our kavanah of Krias Shema is not so real, it's not so intense. So therefore, even the chassan on the night of his wedding can have that level of kavanah and read Shema. And he says if he doesn't, it actually seems like a little arrogant, so to speak. He's saying, usually I have extraordinary kavanah and tonight I can't. So he says this is not really appropriate in today's generations, and this is the halacha in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Simen Ayin. Ches, Kol HaTmein, all those people who are impure, ritually, spiritually impure, Chayavin b'Krias Shema. This doesn't take away the obligation of Krias Shema, Mavarchen Lefanel, Lachrev Ein B'Tomasam. And they make the bracha before Shema and after Shema, even when they retained their impurity. Even though they have the capacity to go to the mikveh and ascend from their tumah that day. So you may think this is a form of negligence. How can a person say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and have the right kavanah when this person is spiritually impure? Kegoin, hanoigin b'sheretz. Those who touch a sheretz is one of those 8 creeping insects or animals that the Torah says if we touch them and they're dead, they cause us to become tameh. Say you touch a dead weasel or lizard or mouse, and then what's the halacha? You have to go into the mikveh. And when you go into the mikveh and you come up from the mikveh, you're pure. You're pure. If you're a kohen, you eat truma the next night. Once there's nightfall after you went to the mikveh, you're ready to go truma. So l'chayr, if somebody touched the sheretz, right, they can go to the mikveh, and then they'll daven ma'ariv and they'll do krishma. Or in the morning, they'll go to the mikveh and then they'll do krishma. So he says you don't have to. Nida. Or somebody who touched a nida, a woman during her cycle. Or zava. A zava is a woman who has a certain emission, which was a disease that was known in the olden times. The Rambam is going to discuss that later. Or mishkavan, or somebody who touches or sits on the mattress or the couch with a nido on the zava, sat or lied. V'kayotze behen, all these other forms of tumah. If you touch the sheretz or these other sources of tumah, you can go to the mikveh and become tired. The Rambam says that's true. But even if you're tameh and you don't go to the mikveh, you're chayev and krishma and make the brachas. However, Ezra and his bezdin made a unique takana. And the takana is that there's one type of tumah, which is a tumah of a balkari. A balkari is somebody who emits the seed of life, who emits the procreative seed. This is called a balkari. So Ezra and his bezdin made a takana, that somebody who emits the seed of life, prior to him going to the mikveh, he should not read words of Torah. They extricated him from the group of all other people who are tameh. Everyone else who's tameh could read Krishma, could learn Torah, could say all the brachas of Krishma, even though they're tameh. Ezra and his bezdin, and let's remember who was Ezra and his bezdin. His bezdin were Anshe Knesset Agdala. The Rambam said in the introduction to Sefer Hayat, to Sefer Mishneh Torah, Ezra was one of the Jews who made Aliyah after Galus Bavel from Bavel, and he helped revitalize the community in Eretz Yisrael, building the second Beis Hamikdash and re-giving Judaism and the Jewish people a new renaissance. So Ezra and his bezdin made a takana that a balkari should not learn Torah until he goes to the mikveh. This is one of the 10 takanos the Gemara says in Maseches Baba Kama that Ezra and his bezdin instituted. Says the Rambam, but something happened. V'loi bashta takana zu b'chol Yisrael. This institution that was created by the Supreme Court of the Jewish people, Ezra and his bezdin Anshe Knesset Agdala. Remember, you had among them prophets. You had Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Nehemiah, Mordechai, Shimon HaTzadik, as we learn in Pirkei Avos. This takana did not spread. It did not saturate among the Jewish people. It was simply not possible for most of the community to maintain it. It was simply too difficult. And therefore, lefichach batla, and therefore the takana naturally dissipated. The Rambam is introducing us here to an extraordinary halacha, which he's going to discuss much later in the last sefer, Shoftim, in Hilchos Mamrim. And that is, even when the highest court institutes a takana, and the Torah gives them the right to create certain institutions, as we learned earlier in the introduction, and we're going to learn later in Hilchos Mamrim, nonetheless, there's a prerequisite for this takana to be able to assume the authority of Torah, and that is, it has to ultimately be accepted by Klal Yisrael. If the tzibur, roivat tzibur, doesn't have the koyach to do it, and they don't accept it, they don't internalize it, doesn't become part of their life, what happens? Says the Rambam, batla, this takana dissipates, and it doesn't have any more halachic validity. And thus, it already became the entrenched tradition of all Jews to learn Torah and to say Shema, even if they are Balei Keri, and they did not go to the mikveh. So even though Ezra and his bezdin made a takana, you can't learn Torah with being a Balkari without going to the mikveh in the morning. And Krishma is, of course, a part of Torah, but the Rambam says this did not take root, and therefore it dissipated. And the reason is because essentially the words of Torah are not susceptible to impurity. The words of Torah retain their purity for eternity. Shenemar, the pasuk says in Yirmiyah Perek Chav Gimel pasuk Chavtes, Halaykoi dvarai ka'esh ne'um Hashem. Hashem says, my words are like fire. Ma'esh eina mekabeles tumah, av divrei Torah eina mekabelen tumah. Just as fire cannot become tameh, there's no way you could contaminate fire. So the Torah is compared to fire. Dvarai is ka'esh. Torah cannot be mekabel tumah. The Gemara tells a story in Masechta Brachas, Dav Chav Beis, that there was a student of Rabbi Yehuda ben Pseira, and one morning he came into the Beis Medrash, and he started to say something, but he was megamgem. He was stuttering. He was he was saying half sentences. The reason was he was a Balkari, and he didn't go to the mikveh, and he felt that he's not allowed to really learn Torah, so he was saying, half sentences, half words. He was sitting in front of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira understood what's happening, and he said, B'ni, my son, psach picha v'ya'irud v'arecha shein divrei Torah mekabel tumah. Open your mouth and let your words shine, because words of Torah cannot accept tumah. So even though you're tamei, and a Balkari has to go to the mikveh, so for example, if he's a kohen, he wouldn't be allowed to eat truma. He of course can go into the Beis Hamikdash, etc. But it's not a problem. It doesn't compromise the Torah and the Krishma, and therefore they said Krishma and they learned Torah even though they did not go to the mikveh. The Rambam is still going to revisit this takana in Hilchos Tefillah Perek Daled, because the same issue happened also with davening, and over there we'll see that the issue gets a little more complicated. This concludes the fourth and last Perek of Hilchos Krias Shema.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.